Hello, everyone. My name is Amphiridial. Welcome to our second workshop of the Developer Challenge 2024. We will have live translations. The link to access it will be sent here in the chat, along with a link to send your questions that will be answered at the end of the workshop. Now, I will hand it off to WooleyWool to talk about programming on Roblox.
Hello, and welcome to my workshop on an introduction to programming. A little bit about myself before we begin. Hello, I'm WooleyWool, and I love to program. Just to name a few, I've worked on a few games such as Steep Steps, Boxing Fighter Simulator, Dawnwood, a summer accelerator game I made with a team of 5, and Holiday Frenzy. The list goes on. There's so many experimental games I've worked on just to expand my knowledge on different areas, such as working with the UI. Now to preface, this talk is content heavy. I'll be going over the most of the basics to studio and programming on Roblox. Because of time, I won't be able to cover everything, but I'll give you resources towards the end of the talk on how to move forward. Now, let's get to it, shall we? All right, what is programming? You've probably heard of it, probably looks really scary, maybe tinkered with it. I mean, just like, look at this. This is like horrifying. Just kidding. But like not to scare you or anything. But what is it really? Let's learn a little more. According to Coursera, it's a technological process for telling a computer which tasks to perform in order to solve problems. All right, that's cool. But how can that be applied to Roblox? Another way you can think of it is with the following statement: crafting lines of code to a programming script to bring our game to life. I'm going to let that sink in with you and just move forward. Think about that statement for a bit throughout this talk. There are different programming languages that can be used. These are the most common ones that you'll be learning, mostly if you're doing computer science or anything like Python and C++. What's really nice is they all have the same idea: write code to solve problems, but they all do it in their own syntax, or in other words, its own language. But the one we'll be using on Roblox is Luau. This is what Roblox supports for programming. It's lightweight and easy to learn. We'll go in depth soon of the different coding blocks that make up Luau. So let's get started with getting to know the specifics of programming on Roblox. This is what you see when you first create a new script. I'll go over the different panels and areas, but for a lot of people who are just starting, this is pretty overwhelming. So hopefully when I go over the different interfaces and panels, it'll be a lot better. What's highlighted right now on your screen is where you'll be typing your code. This is essentially where you're going to be identifying different variables, writing functions, etc. This is where most of the work will be done when you're programming. Next, we have the line numbers. These will be really helpful for debugging, which is fixing issues that may occur in your code, and identifying where your code is having an error, and much more. Next, we have the Explorer. This is where the different classes, such as server storage, replicated storage, players, etc., and instances like baseplate, scripts, etc., are listed. Next, we have the properties. This is where you can edit properties such as color, position, rotation, etc., manually or through code. A lot of people like to refer to these, especially when you're working with like visual effects or different things that you want being done to specific objects. Next, we have the output. This is where you'll see all of your warnings, your print statements that you might write down, and errors. And finally, this is the command bar. This is where you can experiment with different code. I use this a lot, especially when I'm trying to work with different properties or different functions that Roblox may provide, just so I can get something in there quickly and test it out on the go. This really helps visualize, especially for me when I'm trying to make different visual effects. All right, that's the end of my talk. Thanks for attending, and make sure to like and sub. Just kidding, we're not done yet. Let's play with the command bar. So if you have Roblox Studio open and you type in print 1 + 2, it should say 3 in the output. Try it out when you get the chance if you can't at the moment. Let's try this out too. If you type this line of code, it will change the color of the baseplate to a random color. These two commands you've tried are mini lines of code. Pat yourself on the back, you just wrote some code. It's the little steps like these that lead to larger gains with larger coding systems. These are the 4 coding blocks I will be discussing about. There is an added bonus after functions that we'll be covering too, but it'll be really brief, which is events. We don't have a lot of time, so let's get right into variables. Here's a simple variable. We declare at the beginning of the line that this is a variable with the term local. Next, we have to name our variable. In my case, I just named it my variable. And now we can set the value of my variable to something. In this case, I just set it to the number 5. By default, it is set to nil, which means it's set to nothing. You can set the variable to essentially anything, like strings, such as like hello world, numbers, as you see with number 5, tables that hold information, objects, and more. Here's another example of declaring a variable. In this case, we're just trying to setting it to our base plate. We declare at the beginning of the line that this is a variable with the term local. Next, we name our variable. In this case, I just named it base plate. And now we can set the value of the base plate to the base plate that is located in the workspace as seen. Remember that this line of code that we wrote in the command bar? We can simplify this down. We can use that variable base plate that we wrote a little bit ago and set its brick color to a random color. This is simplified down from what was done before, and we don't have to repeat ourselves with having to call workspace.baseplate over and over if we want to change its position, its rotation, its orient, whatever you want to do with it. All you have to do is just do baseplate dot what you need to do from there. Alrighty, now let's move forward and learn more about if and else statements. These are used to have certain lines of code execute if the logic is true. This is our declared variable x, and it is set to the number 5 just for simplicity. What's highlighted is our logic statements. These are used to identify if what we are passing is true or false. In this case, we are trying to see if the value x is equal to 5. Because it is equal to 5, it will run the highlighted print statement, x is equal to 5. Cool. Now, if we change the value of x to 4, for example, it is no longer true, and the else statement will run and print what is highlighted, which is x is not equal to 5. All right. Now, I added an else if. This might be a little scary first. But this means that if the original statement isn't true, the next statement, x is less than 5, will run and check to see if it's true. And if it's not true, then run the else. What's highlighted right now will run because x is equal to 5 and print out the statement x is equal to 5. But if we change that value to 4, the first statement will check to see if 4 is equal to 5, which it isn't, I don't think. The else if statement will now run and see if 4 is less than 5, and it is. And so the print statement will execute. X is less than 5. And finally, if we change the x to 10, both the if and else statements are no longer true. So the else will execute and the print statement inside of it will print. X is not equal to 5. Now, moving from if and else statements, let's look at loops. There are 3 different types of loops in Luo, but in this workshop, we'll be only covering 2. In this example, we will be looking at while loops. It only runs if the logic of the while loop is true, which you can see x is greater than 0. This is our declared variable x that is set to a number 5, just for simplicity. Next, what we have highlighted is the while statement. We are checking to see while x is greater than 5, do the following, which the following is the print x, and x minus equals 1, which is our loop body. We need to make sure that we are doing some sort of change to the x to prevent an infinite loop. And if we don't do anything about it, then unfortunately our code will crash. And there's a possibility that the game will crash, but hopefully not. In this case, we are doing so just by subtracting 1 from x. After the loop is finished, the print statement will print liftoff. One thing I wanted to note is while loops, and any loops in general, by default, yield. Yield means the code will not continue to run until the while loop or any loop finishes running. Here's another example of a loop, the for loop. It's just what it does essentially is it loops through a table of values. In this case, we just have 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 in a table. Usually people will use this, usually developers would use this to work with data, different children in a folder, etc. X is our declared variable, and it's set to a table of values, like I mentioned before. And this is where our loop is declared. I is the index in our table. For example, if I wanted the value from index 1, it would return 5. If I want the index 2, then be 4, etc. While v is the value that is being currently looped through. We call in pairs with x so that we can go through each of the values in pairs with it being the index and its associated value. The for loop can only loop through tables, mainly used with tables, dictionaries, contents of a folder, and etc. After the loop is ran, the print statement at the end will print liftoff. Moving forward, let's talk about functions. Functions are primarily used to help prevent code from being repeated and make it easier to read. Imagine if I just copied everywhere this function that has 100 lines of code. And let's just say we copied it like 5 times in different areas. Imagine if I changed one thing in one of those functions and one of those like hundreds of lines of code. Now I have to go through each of those areas that I pasted and change those too. This is where functions come in. You just have to call the function and change it only once, and it will take care of it from there. And it also makes it easier to read because it's a lot better calling a function than having to read 100 lines of code in this already large function that you're working with. We declared that this is a function using the term function. We name our function next. In this case, I named it my function. And we can pass in parameters to this function, like a number or instance. In this case, I just left it blank since we were just printing hi there. We put the code that we want to run in the function in the function's body. In this case, it's just the print statement with hi there. And after we create our function, we have to call the function so it runs. And so when you call my function, it will run the print statement hi there. Here's an example of the while loop that we used earlier. We could call the function countdown, and we pass in the value, which is the 5, for it to count down. And so it will loop through and count down and print liftoff when completed. As you can see, I put 5 inside one of the parameters when I'm calling countdown. In the creation of the function, we have an x. That's going to be the value that's being passed in. And from there, it's going to loop through. And once it's done, print liftoff. Roblox has lots of pre-built functions that you can use in your game. And since there are so many, at the moment, I'm not able to go through each and every one of them just because there's a lot of them. So I highly recommend looking through the creator docs where it talks about the different functions. But mainly today, we'll be looking at one of them, get player from character. This is what the function name is, get player from character. We have to pass in, this function is looking for a parameter to pass in. So in this case, we're trying to pass in a character of the player. And one thing I didn't get to mention is functions are able to return values, such as if you're trying to return a Boolean or like a number or an object, if you're trying to look for something, functions are able to return it. And in this case, what we're trying to get out of this function is the player. Here's some example code. Looks a little scary at first, but we'll go step by step through what each and everything means. First, we need to get the player class. This is where the function get player from character comes in. We are able to call it from calling the player's class. Next, we're just going to create an arbitrary variable named character, and we're just going to equal it to some character. Right now, it's arbitrary. It won't work if you just do it like this, but just for simplicity's sake, we're going to just leave it as is. Next, we will create the player variable, pass in the arbitrary character variable that we make into get player from character. And finally, we will check to see if the player is not nil, and if it isn't, let's just print their name, their username. And finally, this is the final area I'll be covering, which are events. And again, there are a lot. And so I'm not really able to go through every single one of them. And I highly suggest looking through the creator docs to get more information on different events. Events are usually used for certain things, like when a certain action is done. For instance, if I hover my mouse over a button, for instance, it will fire an event. Or like if I touch a part, it will fire an event. So events are really useful if you want action-based things to occur. So like, for instance, I want to see if a player joined or left. Roblox has you covered. Want to see if a object was added to a folder or model? Again, Roblox has you covered. And the one that we're looking mostly at today is the touched event. This is what the event name is, which is just touched. This is what's going to be returned to us when the touched event is fired, which is just going to be a part. And finally, this is what is going to be the returned event connection. Here's some example code. Let's go through it. This is the object that we are going to be working with. You can just create a part in the workspace. This is the function that we'll be using for when the touched event fires. This is what's going to be ran when it occurs. This is for calling the actual touched event, so part.touch. And we're going to connect the function to when this event is fired, which is we're going to be connecting the touched function. Now, if we look at this, this is going to be working with the different players. So for instance, with with players, if you want to check to see if like I touched this part, we want to get the player out of it. And so when we are working with like the touch function that we wrote earlier, we had to do a few changes to it. So as you can see, we changed what's going to be going in, which is going to be the part. And notice how with the get player from character, instead of just passing in the part, we're passing in the part.parent because we're trying to get the character of the player. You can't really get the player's character. You're not really able to get the player from using the character's foot, for instance. And again, if the player is not equal to nil, then the player's name will be printed. Wow, that was a lot. And that's just the beginning of your programming journey on Roblox. Here are some 4 tips I wanted to pass down to all of you so that when you move forward from this workshop, you're able to continue programming on Roblox. The first one is, as I brought up a few times, is refer to the docs. The docs will teach you a lot about different areas of Roblox with programming, such as working with different properties, different functions, different methods, and different events. It's your best friend and it has all the info you need. I always refer to this every time I wanted to get something, such as like working with like mobile or working with different events and different parts. So highly recommend using that. Another thing with events is working with remote events. This allows you to communicate with the player and the server. When you are working on a game and you want to try to show how many coins a player has, you would use a remote event to fire off and send over that information to the player so they are able to display that. And so using remote events is really critical for showing those different information that the player may want to see, or having different visual effects be fired off. It really depends on what your game is. Next is learning more. Learn more about the different events and functions, etc. I know for me, when I was trying to start off, I would just explore different areas. I would be like, oh, okay, so if I could do this, why can I not do this? And then just like play around with like different functions, different properties, and different events, because that's what really shapes a lot of our games that we are creating. And finally, if you're stuck, seek help on the developer forum. The developer forum is filled with different creators from the community, and a lot of them are willing to help you out. You're able to post your own little thread and talk about what your issue is, or if you're like stuck on how you're supposed to write something, you're able to post about it, and different creators will come together and help answer your question. A lot of times, if you have an issue, someone has asked it before, so I highly recommend looking to see if someone has asked it. And if you can't really find anything, then you are free to post it and gain some help from others. That's all I had for this talk, and we'll be able to go over to QA. And if you're heading off, thank you so much for attending my workshop. Hopefully you learned something new.
Thank you so much, Wooly, for this amazing presentation. And now Wooly will be taking some questions, so feel free to use the QR code on the screen in order to do so. That being said, let's get into some questions. So, first question is, how long does programming take to learn to become an intermediate programmer?
Ooh, that's a really good question. It honestly really depends on how fast you're able to like learn different things. I know for me, it did take a long time just because like it's so new to me with like programming, and so I had to learn like what variables and all these different things that Roblox has to offer, on top of trying to learn the different functions and different events that are being offered. And so for me, it just took like practice and practice just to get to a level where, all right, I can use this knowledge to create like a game that is playable by others. It will take time, but after practice, you'll get to that point.
Awesome. Thank you. Next question is, do you have any tips for the game jam?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I guess my biggest tip for you with programming is start small. Try to create different prototypes of different functions, and work with like arbitrary parts. Like it could just be a little part. You don't need the model that your builder or someone is creating. Just work with something, work with that object, get it to work how you would like it to work. And then when you are given the final model, have your code that is already working work with that model. Just don't bite off more than you can chew is my best tip.
Great answer. And the next question is, as Roblox grows and becomes more popular over the decade, how do you think the influence of programmers will change and
Ooh.
overall the growth of the Lua U community?
Um, that's a really good question. Um, I guess as Roblox is expanding, they're giving more tools and different services and classes to work with for developers. So Roblox is always changing. So there's always better ways to implement different features into your own games. I know like recently Roblox has released the drag detector, which has been like a huge help with like if you want to drag a part around. Just because like before you had to create your own hacking method to do so. So I feel like with all these new implementations that Roblox is adding, it's going to help. It's going to greatly bring in a lot of different creators, just because a lot of the ways that we had to program different things in the past are becoming a lot more simplistic, and it's becoming a lot more friendly for people to get started with the Roblox or get started with creating on Roblox.
For sure. Our next question is, can you quickly explain the Explorer? For example, where to put what scripts?
Yeah, let me go over to my slides. Uh, right, there you go. So with the Explorer, there are two different areas that you can put your scripts in. Typically, a lot of people will put their scripts in the server script service. There are people who will put like different, this is a little bit more advanced, but like you're able to create module scripts where it will hold functions and different classes that you can create, like custom classes. And so a lot of people will put those in like server storage, or sometimes even in server script service if they want to refer to it really quickly. So I recommend, if you're working on the server side, to put those scripts. Whereas for the client, like what's seen from the player. Typically, people will write it in either starter GUI or starter player scripts.
Sounds good. Our next question is, if you want to make a full game, what should you learn? Like data storing, etc.
Ooh. If you want to create a full game, it honestly depends on like what your goal is going to be. Typically, games will require some sort of saving data. You're going to need some sort of like backend system to work with the different player events that are coming in, or different like things that are happening throughout the gameplay. Also, you'll need to work on the front end because players want to see something change. They don't want to just sit there and be like, am I making money? Like, what am I doing? So you want to be able to show off like any changes or anything that's being done. Again, what I've brought up is I would start small and grow your code base. Don't overthink it, because if you overthink it, it's going to become overwhelming for you, and it will be a bit too much. And unfortunately, that's where people drop off.
Gotcha. And then next question is, how much time do you recommend to spend programming on a day for a good learning?
Ooh. So what I recommend doing, and it's something I've been starting to do lately just because it's helped me a lot, is doing a Pomodoro, which is like you work straight for 25 minutes and you just take 5 to 10 break and rinse and repeat for like a few more times and then take a longer break. I found that to be the best because during those breaks, if you're having an issue or something, your mind is still working. And so you'll be like, oh, I could do this. And then when you come back to it, you'll be like, there you go. I know for me, when I first started off, there were issues or bugs I was having. And I was like, oh my God, I can't figure this out at the moment. And when I stepped away from my computer, I was like, wait a second. And then I went over there and I tried the idea that I had in my mind, and bam, it worked. So I feel like it honestly depends on how much time you want to put into it, but I don't recommend putting in too much time as your brain might start to get a little fried. And I recommend taking breaks because breaks are really important, and we don't want you to be overwhelmed or overbrained.
Yeah, that all makes sense. Next question is, what's some stuff you wish you knew before you started out?
Oh, what are some stuff? I guess I wish I knew a lot more about creating my own like classes. I felt like when I was starting off, it was just like my code was so like unorganized. It was so ugly looking. Like even when I look back at it, I like cringe. Like my body just cringes so badly. But I wish I knew that because now I work with classes a lot and it helps bring down the mess of code that I have. And like if I'm having an issue or I need to find something, I'll be like, oh, it's in this script. Oh, it's in that script. Whereas before it was like, where do I change the text of the coins? It's like it should be in here, but it's not in here. It's somewhere else. So I wish I knew a lot more about like organization, and I learned it the hard way. And now I'm a lot more organized. I'm very paranoid about it too.
Yeah, thank you. And then the next question is, what is the importance of remote events in this type of project and what are its limits?
The importance of the remote events, I would say, is you're trying to communicate to the player, or the player is trying to communicate with the server. Uh, Different things are going on. So, like for instance, if I want a cutscene to play, like if the player has done something and I want a cutscene to play from the server, I want to tell the client, okay, play this cutscene, do this and do that. That way, the player is able to know, like, oh, I did something. Or, like, for instance, if I want a visual effect to be done with the remote event, you would typically, if you're doing anything with visual effects, you want to keep it on the client because if you do it on the server, it's just it's going to overload a lot of players, or like it's going to do things that you don't want it to do. Like it's a lot more choppier, whereas on the client it's a lot more smoother. So with the remote event, you're able to like use it to display different visual effects or like different like visual effects to make your map come to life. Those are like a few examples that you could use them for.
Sounds good. And our last question is, what are some important security considerations? Like, what is very important and what should a beginner scripter almost immediately know?
Um, the biggest thing with programming, like with like using remote events, is you don't want to tell the client everything that like you don't want to tell everything to the client because unfortunately people will take advantage of that, and so when they take advantage of that, they'll manipulate like your game scripts to send off like, oh, actually I own 100,000 coins. I should have that, and like you send it over to the server, and the server's gonna be like, oh, okay, and then just like add it. We don't want that, and so on the server, you have to add in all these different checks and all these different things just to make sure, like, is this even possible for the player to earn this amount? Or should they be earning this amount? And so, like, I recommend, like, if your code can be exploited or changed or done in, like, any way, that's a huge security vulnerability. And so I recommend just, like, going through, making sure that you can add in these different checks to prevent that because unfortunately, some players are a bit more into like messing with the game scripts, and we don't want that because it is a bit hard sometimes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Willie, for your presentation and for answering all these questions. I want to let everyone know that you can stay tuned for our next workshop about 3D modeling by Evil Artists next Friday at 10 a.m. PT. Thank you so much to everyone who came today, and we hope to see you next time.